All right, as folks continue to join us, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Julia with Politics in Prose. We're live with author Erik Fisher and Beth Macy discussing The Urge, Our History of Addiction. You can find a link in the chat column to purchase your copy of the book, which comes out next week directly from Politics in Prose. If you have a question this evening, please use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We'll move to questions in the last portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To enable captions, click the CC live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. And we do want to thank all of you out there for joining us this evening. We are very grateful to our loyal family of customers keeping our business and our spirits afloat. Let's get to this exciting new book. Even after a decades-long opioid overdose crisis, intense controversy still rages over the fundamental nature of addiction and the best way to treat it. With uncommon empathy and erudition, Erik Fisher draws on his own experience as a clinician, researcher, and alcoholic in recovery as he traces the history of a phenomenon that, centuries on, we hardly appear closer to understanding, let alone addressing effectively. Author Erik Fisher is an addiction physician and bioethicist and an assistant professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia University, where he works in the Division of Law, Ethics, and Psychiatry. He also maintains a private psychiatry practice focusing on complementary and integrative approaches to treating addiction. His writing has appeared in Nautilus, Slate, and Scientific American Mind, among other outlets. And Beth Macy is the author of the widely acclaimed and best-selling books Dope Sick, True Vine, and Factory Man. Based in Roanoke, Virginia for 3 decades, her reporting has won more than a dozen national awards, including a Nieman Fellowship for Journalism at Harvard. On behalf of Politics in Prose, please join me in welcoming Erik Fisher and Beth Macy. Thank you both. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Julia. Really appreciate that introduction. And thanks to everybody for coming to support the almost publication of this fantastic book. When the galley arrived on my doorstep, I picked it up and I wasn't really going to have time to read that day, and I just couldn't put it down. It is seamless. It is so elegantly written that you can hardly believe like writing isn't even his full-time job. It does a beautiful job of weaving his personal story, always kind of making you want to know more, with this just whip smart analysis of where we are today, as well as, I mean, it's right there in the subtitle, the history, like a really disparate history that he draws so many threads together with in just such a seamless, beautiful way. So I think we will go to questions around 8:40, 8:45. But I was hoping, Carl, that you would start just by giving us an overview of why you wrote this book and why you structured it the way you did.
Yeah, absolutely, Beth. And before I jump in, thank you so much for moderating and for being here in conversation. It's an honor, and I really appreciate your support and your feedback. It's been great to be in touch. And thanks also to all the people who came out tonight. I know you could be anywhere virtually in the world and chose to be here, and it means the world. So thanks for joining us. So Beth, you asked about why I wrote it the way I did, and the book is structured primarily as a history, but I also chose to include my personal narrative. And the crux of that narrative is when I was in residency training, studying psychiatry at Columbia Psychiatry Department, I had a real crisis of addiction. Even though outwardly I was achieving and I thought I was putting on a strong front to the world, I had a really serious alcohol and stimulant problem. And it came to a head in my second year when, in the context of a binge, I wound up in Bellevue Hospital, floridly manic, psychotic, complete break from reality. And I had to come to terms with my own addiction, as well as the addiction that has been in my family for generations. Both of my parents are alcoholics, and others as well, other ancestors further back. And we can talk more about this if we have time and if it comes to this, but through tremendous privilege, as a white person, as somebody who had financial resources, who was a doctor, I got access to really good care. And I was really taken care of and got a lot of support. And about a year into my recovery, I felt safe. I didn't feel like I was going to relapse, but I had the sense that I still didn't fully understand what went wrong in me. And so I got really curious about looking beyond medicine to history, philosophy, literature, arts, to better understand addiction, basically because it's a book I wanted and it didn't exist. There's so much great history and scholarship in other fields about addiction. Beth, you've drawn on that for some of your own work. But I wanted a synthesis. And I think naively, I wanted somebody who would say, this is what addiction is, or just give me the answer across time and space. And I had the great good fortune of learning from our colleagues in history, in philosophy, and otherwise, that addiction, while it is real, while it is deadly and deserves great care and respect, it also is very strongly influenced by culture and society in history. And looking back over the ages helped me to appreciate how our understanding of addiction, our ideas about addiction, the many different ideas that can be attached to a complicated and messy word like addiction, are all dependent on the historical process and the social process. And so that's the answer to your question, Beth, is why did I write it the way I did? Why did I include the personal narrative? It was really to ground that history in what mattered, and almost as a forcing mechanism for me to keep it related to what mattered most to me and what mattered most to my patients and what mattered most to the problems that we face today in the world. And also simultaneously and not separately, to disclose my own bias, because it is just my story. It's not the story of addiction. It's not, I don't intend to pronounce on what addiction is or what history tells us in some sort of definitive way. It's necessarily limited and contingent and based in my upbringing and my background. And I wanted to be explicit about that too, because I think that's just about as far as all of us can go with it.
Thank you. One of the ideas you mull that was new to me, because, I've been reporting, I guess, about addictions going back to 2012. And, you learn these things, you hear them over and over. Addiction is a chronic relapsing disease. Addiction, I've said it myself in interviews, in my books. One of the ideas or the arguments you make is that journalists and practitioners alike, society, if you will, the culture, is pretty clear in the prevailing narrative that, quote, addiction is a disease. You had a great piece in the New York Times that was an excerpt from the book, where you say that framing that addiction is disease is missing a lot. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that and how your way of looking at addiction through the lens of history turns this prominent model of how we conceptualize it today on its ear.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Beth. So let me say it this way, because it relates to the history. What I think of as addiction and what our prevailing view of addiction is different from what, say, Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers of the United States, said addiction was. It's different than Protestant reformers said addiction was back in, say, the 1520s, 1530s. And it's different than conceptually some of the other related concepts throughout philosophy, like Aristotle's writing on self-control, or other even spiritual writings going back even farther, have to do with addiction. And I say that because Benjamin Rush had a notion of addiction as a disease. Back in the 1780s, he was among the first to put this disease label really squarely on the notion of addiction. But to him, addiction as a disease didn't mean that medicine was the best. It didn't mean that its causes were necessarily rooted in biology. He also talked really expansively about social and economic forces. And he was a founding father, after all. He might have been president if he didn't have some big scandal involving basically jumping the chain of command back during the Revolutionary War. That addiction as a disease has existed throughout time in various iterations, in various ways. But from my perspective, that disease narrative was used in very specific ways through the mid 20th century, say, 1950s, 1960s, where advocates were really trying to correct a terrible wrong. They were trying to correct the fact that my profession, the medical profession, had essentially abandoned the care of people with addiction. And some of these early advocates had to force open the doors of hospitals because people in life-threatening alcohol withdrawal couldn't even get treatment. But in the process of doing so, I think other associations got attached to the notion of disease. For some, but not all people, it meant that all addiction was alike in the same way. For some, but not all people, it meant that people with addiction were broken in some sort of way and they were hopeless and that they could never get better. And for some, but not all people, it meant that addiction was necessarily progressive, that everybody got worse in the same way, and so forth and so on. And some of those ideas have even become intensified or further complexified in recent years. But the problem, as I see it today, is that it's a messy concept. When we say addiction is a disease, some people just mean medicine can help, or just mean that people with addiction deserve care and compassion. And those are really important concepts, and we really have to support them. But we don't need disease to get there. And addiction as a disease can also mean that we only look at it through the lens of biology, that the best way of viewing addiction is as a sort of medical problem rooted in molecules and dopamine and brain structures. And historically, time and time again, that sort of framing has served to overlook other broader systemic issues like racism, like oppression, like the social and economic drivers of the determinants of health. And so I don't question, we were even talking about this earlier in the green room, the virtual green room. I don't doubt that there are people for whom the disease framing is really useful and maybe even life-saving. And I wouldn't deny them that. If somebody came into my consulting room as a psychiatrist, I would never say, you shouldn't think about it as a disease. Far from it. I think that people should really self-determine their own recovery and their own identity when it comes to addiction. But I think on balance, as a matter of policy or as science communication, the disease word, it just gets misleading. It has too much kind of baggage attached to it.
Great. We were saying earlier in the virtual green room that some of the feedback that you got on the piece was triggering. Wondered if you could elaborate on that a bit. I mean, it's a very personal story you tell. Mm-hmm. And addiction is very personal to many, many readers.
Oh, yeah. Well, that stuff doesn't bother me as much, honestly, Beth. I mean, one time when I wrote a smaller magazine article, somebody said, basically, you're clearly an asshole and best of luck to you and best of luck to your future ex-wife. And I said,
oh my God.
That's kind of funny. I don't mind that. And I'm prepared for that, I think, psychologically, for the personal attacks. I more at the level of emails, less like Twitter trolls, but like more at the level of like emails. I could sense that some people, maybe had been like wronged or harmed by our current miserable treatment system, and had found like great help and support from those kinds of structures of understanding that are offered sometimes by the disease model. Maybe they got sober in rehab. I'm just guessing, but just based on some of the people I've met in recovery or other experiences, maybe they met people in recovery, in rehab and treatment and otherwise who use the disease narrative to help somebody get some insight into the severity of their condition. And maybe it was helpful in that purpose. And so, that makes me feel bad that some people miss the core of the argument and what I just tried to say, that it's not to take away from anybody's individual experience, but
Sure.
it's more about how we communicate in a broader sense. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, you can tell me yourself that, like, I know that
No,
you've
I
certainly
just
caught
there's
flack.
it's such
I
a
think anybody who writes about addiction, they're gonna catch
you're gonna
some
catch holy
heat.
hell. Yeah. Wait till you show up in a movie poster with horns on your head.
Oh my
Okay.
goodness.
So I want to get into the history, which is so just surprising and interesting in this book. I wonder, since the book isn't out, if you could give folks a preview of some of the examples in it that illuminate how virtually all of the phases of addiction for millennia in the world have hinged on the classic pattern of kind of this honeymoon period of uncritical use. You could think of OxyContin when it came out in
Mm.
1996, and the whole changing the narrative that opioids were virtually non-addictive, followed by a backlash that's often only used against certain types of users. What were
Yeah,
your
sure
some of your
thing.
favorite history pieces that to you really told this?
Yeah, and because you brought up the notion of epidemics, let's go there, because that was one of the really surprising things in looking into the history, because I began writing from the standpoint of a historic overdose crisis that we're still in the middle of, still worsening. Um, but I found that drug epidemics are really nothing new, that we've been having them for 500 years. And you could date the first one to the very beginning of colonialism and intercontinental trade and mercantilism with Christopher Columbus. I start with Christopher Columbus bringing back tobacco. And that was perceived as, in the words of one of the contemporaneous writers in the 16th century, as a plague epidemical. And from Europe all the way out to Mongolia and Japan, countries tried these repressive crackdowns to the point of cutting off noses or confiscating all of somebody's property, or even the death penalty for the use of tobacco. And this is well before, obviously, we had any sense of like the health risk of tobacco. We're talking about like 1600s, 1610s. And it didn't do anything. It was just such a great illustration of how prohibition alone is not going to work, that prohibitionist crackdowns are never enough to deter use. And so through the lens of different epidemics, but also different individual experiences, I take a look at what are some of the causes and conditions that enable waves of use, and how do people make sense of their own use. So on the other end of the spectrum, going micro, one example that I just really love, I think he's a really compassionate and sort of sad figure, is Thomas de Quincey, who in many ways wrote the first addiction memoir, almost exactly 200 years ago, actually. We haven't put that in any of the press materials. Maybe we should. I don't know. I don't know if people care
Yeah,
about Thomas de Quincey, but
it'd be a standalone piece on your
yeah,
favorite.
it was in the 1820s. He wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater, and he famously claimed that he had essentially kicked his opioid problem. In his case, it was laudanum, which is this sort of like ruby red tincture of distilled opium that people drank. But he didn't. Yeah, he had always planned to write a sort of sequel to his book to explain how he didn't really kick it, and to write more about the pains of opium, but he never quite did it. And that's an example of how personal identity becomes deeply wrapped up in the notion of addiction. It's not just somebody getting hijacked by some sort of dangerous substance. It also has to do with the way we think of ourselves and the sort of romantic image we put up for ourselves. And yeah, we could go into other examples as they come up, but tracing it through to recent times, crack epidemic, opioid epidemic, and what's on the horizon.
What were the most surprising or illuminating moments in terms of treatment? Maybe you could give us kind of a best case. I'm thinking of, people are always surprised when you say that Nixon actually had a really good methadone treatment system in place before the war on drugs was declared. And what are some of the, maybe we start with kind of the worst ideas about treatment that you've run across in history?
Yeah, it's so funny. My mind went immediately to Nixon and methadone. And so Nixon famously named the war on drugs, which is really a war on people that has been going on for time immemorial. There was certainly a war on drugs in the 1910s and 1920s and so forth. And then there were war on drugs going back to tobacco, and when tobacco was associated with savagery and the lower classes and the wrong sorts of people. So that's what Nixon is remembered for, and rightly so. Because he did a lot of harmful things as it relates to drugs and otherwise. But Nixon was also called in a sort of landmark policy paper the first therapeutic president, because he enacted these really energetic and supportive programs for the treatment of addiction. And one of the main things he did was support methadone. Methadone was developed around that time. It was developed in the late 1960s, but it needed to be disseminated, and it was going uphill because there's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of stigma against addiction, and then there was a lot of internalized stigma within the addiction treatment community, where people thought that medications were inherently wrong or not clean or somehow bad. And Nixon, in collaboration with this fantastic psychiatrist, Jerry Jaffe, supported methadone programs in a way that would be totally unrecognizable today. So when I think of a methadone clinic in New York City, where I see them and when I was exposed to them, and when we briefly rotated through in Columbia residency, they're like fortresses. They're bars on the windows, and people have to line up outside in a really regimented way. And there's a lot of open air dealing around them, and they're just very restrictive. And the methadone programs that were inaugurated under Nixon's watch were totally different. They were really, and it's not Nixon. Nixon didn't come up with the idea for that. He was supporting something that Marie Neiswander and Vincent Dole, these two enterprising clinicians, along with a few others at Cornell and the Rockefeller University, did. But there are these beautiful wraparound programs with holistic services and real support for educational programming and vocational programming. There was a real recognition that addiction was more than just somebody being taken over by a substance. It also had to do with finding meaning and purpose in life, and supporting people in those aims. And it was really in subsequent sort of backlashes against certain types of treatment and certain types of people, namely Black and brown people and the urban poor, who are associated with the wrong kind of drug use, that methadone kind of got warped into a tool of control. So, in answer to your question, it's probably both things in the same example. It's a beautiful example. It'd be great if we could get back in that direction, but then it's an example of how medicine can be warped as a tool for social control and domination, and overlooking the need to put the patient first and work to support the patient.
Yeah, so we still have like an 88 to 90% treatment gap. And by that, I mean, 10 to 12% of people with SUD were able to access treatment in the last year. Was going to ask you this later, but since this has already come up, what would be the steps to get a more Jaffe/Nixon like approach to this in an era when our politics are so toxic? And I report from West Virginia, where harm reduction has been banned in many places at the same time, and they're having skyrocketing HIV rates. And we tend to think we're so much more woke now. And yet when you read about these early Nixon years and what Dr. Jaffe did, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Beth, I would love to get your feedback too, because you're on the ground, and I would love to hear about your reporting and what you're hearing and what the causes for hope are. Because I do think there are causes for hope. But I'd love to get your perspective too. I'll just answer briefly then. I think at a pragmatic sense, it's just about putting the patient first and making our yardstick someone's wellness and someone's functioning rather than control. And in medicine, for a variety of reasons, our yardstick for too long has been controlling someone's use, abstinence only. And I think abstinence is a great treatment goal. It's my own treatment goal. I'm abstinent. I intend to stay abstinent. But there are a lot of people for whom that does not work. And we're not doing our job meeting with folks and working with folks until and if the point they decide to pursue that treatment goal. And we could do a lot better job of being flexible with people, meeting them where they are with medical treatment. But what do you think? I mean, do you have thoughts based on your reporting about how we get back to a more sort of compassionate and patient-focused approach?
Well, I've been following these harm reductionists around for a couple of years now, and some of them are really doing some amazing work, but they're just not doing it to the scale that matches the scale of the epidemic. And, you know, basic things that I think the federal government should get rid of, like the ban on paying for needles. We know that when people get access to needles, it can become the carrot. We know that people that go to needle exchanges are 5 times more likely to eventually enter treatment. And you're right, that abstinence treatment shouldn't be the goal for everyone. I mean, basically, we know what works. People like you tell us what works, but we're just not doing it. And I just think we need a lot more leadership to get the word out. I mean, it's hard to even just break through the noise of all the news that's going on right now. Just got asked to write an op-ed piece, and it's like, holy crap, people, if you add up all the drug overdoses since 1996, we've actually lost 1 million people. 1 million. And it just was kind of like yawn. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to break through that, because our deaths of despair are not going to turn around until we do. So we've lost 1 million by 2029. That number is predicted to be 2 million. So it's a doubling in just the next 7 years. But it's, you know, it's like the climate crisis and the insurrection crisis and everything else. It's hard to get the right kind of attention focused on it. But I want to go back to your book. And this sort of goes to this idea of abstinence and AA and NA, which have become such huge cultural sort of touchstones for people. I mean, we both know lots of people for whom it has really saved their life, despite the fact that we also know lots of people who've been like stigmatized in the rooms for, quote, not being clean if they're taking buprenorphine or methadone. But you managed to find a woman who was overlooked in your quest to tell the story of how the 12 steps came to be. I mean, you often read about Bill Wilson, but I was hoping you could tell us about Marty Mann and why you chose to focus on her story.
Thank you, Beth, because it's Marty Mann is not like a sound biteable story. Not enough people know about her. So I'm so glad we're here among friends at Politics and Prose, and we have the space to chat about some of these characters. So Marty Mann is just this amazing woman who was one of the very earliest AA members and was absolutely essential to the creation and the dissemination of the Fellowship of AA. In some ways, maybe even more important, not to the creation, because Bill W. mostly wrote the big book and all the rest, but in some ways, maybe even more important to the spread of those ideas. She was a socialite and like a real high society woman, lived in London, was hanging out with the Bloomsbury group and Virginia Woolf, and quickly descended into really, really extreme alcoholism to the point where she was homeless at points. And like I mentioned, this was a period of time, 1920s, 1930s, where the medical profession had totally abandoned the treatment of people with addiction. Even for this woman who had a tremendous, at the very least, personal capital and great connections. She couldn't get treatment. There were a lot of psychiatrists who wouldn't even treat her. And eventually, through a string of happy accidents, she made her way to an asylum, and then got connected to AA when it was this really scrappy and small fellowship, basically meeting in Bill Wilson's home in Brooklyn Heights. And Bill Wilson became her sponsor at a time when women were really underrepresented. I mean, women are still underrepresented in AA, but she was very few and far between back then. Women alcoholics, by the way, were considered unreliable and loose, and like they would like corrupt the men somehow. So it was really hard for women back then. It still is bad. It still is nowadays. But like to the point where like they weren't even allowed in certain AA meetings, and they were told to just go hang out with the wives, even though the wives of the male alcoholics didn't necessarily have addiction problems. Anyway, Marty Mann is a sort of a heroic character who stuck it out through all of that and did it extraordinarily well. But she was a public relations genius, and that was her profession. And then basically woke up in the middle of the night one night and said, there has to be a way to apply this to the problem of addiction. When it's so criminalized and it's so stigmatized, we have to be able to spread the word. And so she embarked on this coast to coast campaign, sometimes giving 200 talks, 250 talks a year.
Wow.
Establishing these local information centers and working to spread a lot of ideas related to AA, but also a lot of ideas aside from AA. So there's a funny relationship between that public advocacy, where it wasn't really AA, but it was kind of AA. She was in recovery. She identified as in recovery. And to this, and she also, by the way, was really a big fan of using the language of disease. She said that all alcoholism is a certain way, and everybody needs it this way, and AA is essentially the only way to go. And so there were some things that she said that I think were a little misleading and misguided. But on balance, she's done tremendous good, and was really instrumental in forming the first addiction society, which today is the American Society of Addiction Medicine.
Wow.
It grew out of her friendship with Ruth Fox, actually, in New York. Was instrumental in getting insurance coverage for some conditions like alcoholism, and then ultimately was a major factor in pushing through legislation on alcoholism in the US government, like basically leaned on her friends and summoned up this massive political campaign to pressure Richard Nixon to sign some of these bills into law. Because there's this whole other complicated story about how he supported drugs, but he didn't support treatment for alcoholism. And that's a supposed rift between alcoholism and other kinds of addiction. But I love Marty Mann. I think she's a fantastic person, and totally, you can get a million books about Bill Wilson. There's there's so much about that guy.
It was such a great surprise, and just to come to that, and you've told it so lovingly, and it came alive so well. Can you talk a bit more about the role of race and the fact that addiction has long been used as a way to prop up the dominant and wealthier classes and make life harder for poor and marginalized groups?
Yeah, sure thing. There's a lot of routes in there. But my mind is going to the Native American experience, because I think people who are signing on to this webinar, at least, they probably have a notion that race is intertwined with drug policy, in the way we police drugs, in the way totally illogical drug laws are basically political cover for oppression, for racism and oppression. But it's maybe not as clear to some people why addiction is related to race. And I think the Native American experience is pretty instructive. So back in the American colonial period, there was a lot of dislocation. There was a lot of war, famine, disease, economic oppression. But then one of the main forms of deprivation was through alcohol. And it wasn't just that people who were suffering a lot turned to alcohol, although that was certainly the case. That people who were suffering under many of those forces eventually turned to alcohol for soothing their suffering. That's certainly true. But it's also that alcohol was deliberately used as a weapon. And then also the notion of Native American alcohol problems was then itself weaponized and used as a weapon. So I described the story of Samson Occam, who in many ways was one of the first writers in the American colonies to write about the problems of alcohol. And what was remarkable about the way he wrote about it was based on his own experience as a preacher. He ranged all across the Northeast, went to upstate New York and out all the way to the furthest tip of Long Island with the Montauk people and otherwise. It was really in touch, kind of like you, Beth, actually. Like, he's like ranging around the country, talking to all these people who are seeing firsthand the problems of addiction and the way it impacts local communities and all the different ways that people are trying to cope. But for him, it was intuitive that it wasn't an individual problem. He also saw how alcohol was a tool of oppression and how stories about alcohol were a tool of oppression. So I write about how he was notable because he didn't just repeat the tired old trope, which even today survives as a sort of firewater myth, the notion that Native Americans are somehow more genetically susceptible to alcohol. And that's, that was really, even in recent decades, has gotten a lot of play, but is weak at best. And really the story is about intergenerational trauma and about the broader forms of domination and oppression and marginalization that are brought to bear on those communities. So yeah, I think we have to be very careful about the way we individualize addiction and the stories we tell about addiction, because they can often become stories about the wrong sorts of people or the wrong sorts of drugs and sort of miss the broader context.
Absolutely. As you were writing, and we'll go to questions right after this, but you say, I think you say in the prologue that the part of why you wanted to tell this book was also to come to a better understanding of your own story. Did you have any aha moments in the research where you began to think, I mean, I know this is your field, so probably you'd already long had those, but a lot of us, like, we learn things about what we think in the process of writing it down. I'm wondering if you had any of those kind of aha moments.
Tons, yeah, because I found tremendous identification with people's stories. There's so many examples that even though there were, cultural wrinkles or, important differences, that I saw the similarities between myself and, say, like a Chinese poet who couldn't stop drinking around like 110 AD, or
Wow.
Somebody with gambling addiction back in the time of the Rig Veda, thousands of years BC. And that really impressed upon me just the reality of addiction. It was really validating, because sometimes if you get into this heady intellectual stuff, it can almost feel like a little airy, like, oh, it's a social construct, or do we even really know what addiction is? And at the end of the day, I know what addiction is in a personal level. I experienced it. I've seen it in my family, and I know it's real. But both seeing that identification and also seeing the important differences was really instructive. And another thing that comes to mind is the varieties of way people recovered over the years. So so many surprises, but one big surprise is that there was this whole mutual aid group predating AA by almost 100 years in the 1840s called the Washingtonians, which was basically a mutual aid group where people came together to try to overcome their common problem with alcohol. And it was enormous. At certain points, there were like multiple percentages of the New York population that counted themselves among the Washingtonians. And they set up halls and banquets, and it was this huge movement. And there are important, we don't have time to get into it, there are important similarities and there are important differences between that and between AA and other 12-step fellowships and our other sort of like traditional modes of recovery nowadays. And I love AA. I got tremendous amounts of connection and support out of AA when I was mandated there earlier in my own recovery. And I think we need more stories about how there are varieties of recovery, that there are many pathways to recovery, that they're all great, and that there's hope. And there's actually more hope than most people might know at first glance, because they don't perceive the tremendous diversity of ways to change and to work with our suffering. So I don't know if that's very specific, but
No, it's great. It's great.
Yeah.
Well, I said that was going to be my last question before I went on, but I'm just like, how did you do your history research? Because that must have been kind of new for you.
It was new. I mean, I like to read, so I read a lot of books. It was a lot of time alone reading books, and then I thought I would be out on book tour and I'd be meeting people in person, and here we are looking at screens. So,
by the way,
there you
he's
go.
in Portugal, and it's 1 a.m. right now.
Yeah.
So,
I was saying it's been fun staying up late the last few nights, so I wouldn't be totally zonked for this thing. So, but anyway, I'm grateful for the connection, and it still is a beautiful event, and it's great. It's wonderful to see everyone here. Truly. What were you talking about? You're asking
your research process for the
research process. Yeah, I asked for help. I did the same thing I did in recovery. I asked for help. I mean, like, the story of my recovery was really about letting go of my sort of self-will and thinking that I could just do it all myself, and realizing that I needed other people, that I wasn't just like, it wasn't my job. And so specifically, I talked to some of the people that you know, and that I've seen you in conversation with in your own books, like David Courtwright and Robin Broom, and tons of other historians that were so generous. And then as I did that, I started to realize that, maybe it wasn't just history, maybe it was also philosophy. So I found a wonderful scholar of St. Augustine at Cornell, and talked about ancient theology, which I knew nothing about, and found other philosophy professors, and just got people on the phone and talked to them. And it was really a beautiful experience. And people really love this topic. And because I think a lot of people have this intuitive sense that addiction points toward the core questions about the human condition. It's not just about some narrow band of human experience. It's universal struggles with self-control and the way we make sense of our suffering in a broader sense. And in that sense, addiction is in all of us. And I saw that across so many of these people, the way their own eyes would come alight. And that, I couldn't have done it without all of them. The notion that like a book is an individual enterprise is so ridiculous to me. It's hilarious.
Absolutely. And the editing and the people reading and giving feedback, and just kind of lighten up different parts of your brain. All right, I'm going to go to the questions now. This is from Kristen Seeberger, who writes, the poet and essayist Wendell Berry said, people use drugs, legal and illegal, because their lives are intolerably painful or dull. They hate their work and find no rest in their leisure. They are estranged from their families and their neighbors. It should tell us something that in healthy societies, drug use is celebrative, convivial, and occasional, whereas among us, it is lonely, shameful, and addictive. We need drugs, apparently, because we have lost each other, unquote. So from a sociocultural standpoint on how loss of community creates an environment of addiction, Kristen would love to hear your point of view on what we can do to create community. That's a great question.
Thank you for that. What a beautiful poem. I love Wendell Berry. I don't know that poem specifically. I read a bunch of Wendell Berry during the early days of COVID for solace. So I think that's beautiful. And it really puts a finger on an important characteristic, that we cannot do it alone. It goes along with some of my response to the last question. And that in a way, addiction at a social level can be symptomatic of deeper problems, that we've had these epidemics for so long. And one theme I saw across different ages is that people want to find a villain. People want to find, like, it's like the one evil drug that takes people over. It's the one bad pharmaceutical company, or maybe it's this other element of social or political policy. And it's so important to emphasize that it's never that simple, and that addiction epidemics going back centuries and centuries have often been related with these times of social upheaval and deprivation and alienation. And not just, especially, it's important to talk about concrete forms of oppression and alienation and marginalization. And also there's a sort of spiritual alienation of losing community and losing connection. And I think we've seen that in COVID, and that's a key part of why overdose rates are just soaring. And we desperately need ways to come together in more wholesome ways that are at least more wholesome than Twitter, for God's sake. But thank you for the beautiful question.
Yeah, it really was. Another attendee asks, in your research into either historical figures or even fictional characters who live with addiction, did you find cases where certain people were romanticized or viewed as heroic for, quote, for fighting through it? Here she says, I keep thinking about the heroin chic image of or glorification of the 1920s, etc.
Absolutely. I'll refer you to my chapter on the Romantics. Thomas de Quincey was one of those characters, for sure, in terms of consciously reshaping the notion of drug use as a sort of revolt against bourgeois society, as a sort of revolt against cultural norms and standards, and then wearing the suffering of addiction as a badge of honor. And you can trace that thread all the way through to Baudelaire and a lot of other French folks. I love the French. I love French culture, but there's a lot of that sort of romanticization of suffering and of suffering of drug use in French culture, all the way up through like Cocteau and Picasso. But then to Burroughs too, especially, and William Burroughs is a key character in the middle section of the book, because he exemplifies some of that sort of heroic posturing in some ways about the role of addiction. So, I think we have to be careful that addiction is not just hijacking. Again, I mentioned this before. It also is deeply wound up in notions of identity and how we think of ourselves in relation to society. And a lot of those outcasts, like Burroughs and the other beats, were pointing toward, getting back to Kristen's question, real problems in society at the time, and also experienced tremendous suffering and caused tremendous pain. So I don't have an answer to it. It's not to throw out the notion of romanticized use entirely, because there is a there, but also be attentive to the dangers of it.
Absolutely. Thanks for that question. This is a question from Becca Gardner, who works at UC Berkeley, creating a recovery program for students. She says, I read your recent piece in the Times and deeply resonated with your story and perspective as a person in recovery. She's wondering how you suggest we shift our practices to align with a more nuanced, multi-causal model.
Yeah, it's such an important and complicated question, Becca. Thank you for that. I don't know how to answer it in some sort of broad and sweeping notion. I just don't know, honestly. But what I can speak to is what I can understand and imagine from what I heard in the question, which is college recovery and local recovery. I think that recovery needs to be about connection within one's own community. And my mind is actually going to the Native American examples again. Some of the Native American figures that I profiled in the book set up their own circles of recovery too, way before the Washingtonians. And some of those traditions are still alive today. They're in the Seneca Nation, for example. They still have these talking circles that were founded when someone around the American Revolutionary period almost died from alcoholism. He wouldn't have called it alcoholism, but you get the point. And had this revelation that we have to come together as a community based on our own values and our own shared sense of purpose. And so I couldn't speak to Berkeley, although I can imagine, I couldn't speak to say like what matters most to folks maybe who are in college or otherwise. But I think that like on the ground, grassroots, peer support and peer recovery is so essential. And really being situated in the community and listening to the community, at least that's something that medicine has not done very well. So I really applaud you for working to set up those types of services. Thank you.
That's a great question. Someone else asks, is there use in someone experiencing addiction to be told or feel that they're doing something wrong, in quotes, or that they're bad, in quotes, to start associating the abuse as contrary to personal ethics? Or should we focus on forgiveness and preservation of self-worth, separating the individual from the act to some extent?
Wow, such a rich question. What I land on is the bad. Shame doesn't work. You know, we know that shame and blame is not helpful. We know that harsh confrontation is not helpful. We have psychological studies on that. And I think you're pointing towards something important in the experience of addiction and recovery, which is that people do have a moral sense that's related to their actions around self-control. And that gets back to Aristotle. So we didn't get the chance to talk about him too much, but I write about Aristotle and specifically his thoughts on self-control and what is often translated as weakness of the will. And for Aristotle, that wasn't some sort of airy philosophical exercise. It was a real life and death exploration of what makes a life worth living. And it was morality as an exploration of the life well lived. And I think the best versions of mutual help recovery do that in 12-step programs or otherwise. To have a really searching and rigorous look at personal morality in the sense of causing harm in our relationship to other people and how that is not separate from taking care of ourselves. That's the way I understand my recovery, at least, is that my own recovery and wellness is not something separate from injustice and racism I see around me. Like there's no such thing as me recovering on my own and just sort of like floating above all of those problems. And so, you know, by the same token, there's no such thing as like meditating your way out of an addiction without being attentive to even your local social context and being aware to those sort of moral elements insofar as they rebound and I think impact your personal wellness. That's my view. But I say that all with what I said at the beginning, which is we have to be very, very cautious about blame, because when it's wielded in an unwise way, it can really hurt people, and it has done for a very long time.
Are there similarities in the psychology between addiction to substances and addiction to behaviors? And this person is disclosing that he or she recovered from an eating disorder when they were younger and felt like they weren't in control of that, quote, urge.
I don't think there is that much of a meaningful distinction between substance addictions and other addictions. And in fact, when you look back at the entry of the word addiction into the English language, there was no such addiction. That's an artificial distinction that was drawn later, often driven by moral panics, often driven by panics about the sorts of bad drugs that we thought were infecting our communities and causing us problems. Racist panics, in other words, and xenophobic panics. You know, I think there are ways that people can use the word addiction in a sort of like loose and cavalier way, like, oh, I'm so addicted to Wordle nowadays. And like, yeah, Wordle is good, but it's not an addiction. Like the way, even back in, say, the 1520s, addiction was a strong devotion. It meant giving up your will. And there was an element of choice there, but there was also an element of losing control. But I don't think, and I think the current research backs me up on this, that even at a neurobiological level, there are astounding similarities between, say, like obesity and substance addictions, or gambling and substance addictions. It's not that some evil drug comes in and hijacks a reward center in a unique way that other things don't do. The drugs aren't that special. They're not that powerful. We see similar brain changes, for example, in those things I just mentioned, in obesity, in gambling, and basically any other sort of reward motivated pursuit So yeah, I would be cautious of drawing those sorts of distinctions, and above all, I would be really careful about validating the experience of people who feel like they really struggle with behaviors, because that can be devastating.
Another question is, from your perspective on the history of addiction, is there any hope of finding a cure for addictive behavior, or is this part of human nature we will always need to deal with?
That's a great question, because I have a simple answer for once. I don't think we'll end addiction. I don't think we'll cure addiction. I think that we have tremendous potential to save lives. We're falling short in so many ways. And I say the we here is both the medical profession and society. There's so many lives we're leaving on the table for not adequately scaling up very simple things that we know would work, like basic harm reduction services, like syringe service programs, or overdose prevention sites, or pick your strategy. Beth, I know you know all these things too. And at the same time, I think this notion that there could be a cure to addiction is really misleading. And there are many times that has caused tremendous harm throughout history, both because of misdirected efforts to try to cure individuals, and also because it was a distraction. Because the notion, say, for example, I wish we could have talked about narco, actually. I guess you'll have to read the book, buy it from Politics and Prose. But there is this massive federal effort to find a cure for opiate addiction in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. And they became so focused on opiates that they totally missed the boat on stimulants. And they even missed the boat on barbiturates, which a lot of people don't know today, but were these really powerful sedatives that at one point were the leading cause of accidental poisoning. So I think we have to be really cautious about the notion of cures while still working as vigorously as we can to work with that kind of suffering.
Fantastic. I think we have time for one more question, maybe two. If addiction isn't a disease, like you said in your op-ed in the Times, why would opioid addicted people need medication for life? There seems to be a disconnect between talking about addiction as not a disease, i.e. not like diabetes, and the marketing concept that people need to be on methadone or bupe for the rest of their lives.
That's an empirical question. And, I'm really happy to see all of you here. And I see one name, which is Robin Williams, who's one of my colleagues at Columbia, who's doing research on this subject.
Yes, he is.
We really, because there's so many things that are underfunded in addiction policy and addiction treatment, but we really don't have nearly enough data on the longitudinal course of treatment with buprenorphine. We're just not very good at prognosis in general in medicine as a whole. I mean, forget about psychiatry. And there are a lot of people who've written on this. Nicholas Christakis has written really nicely on this. But we don't know what the sort of mean duration of treatment on bupe is, or what the indicators are for when somebody should come off buprenorphine, or what should be in place for people to do so safely. And that leads a lot of addiction clinicians, I know, in a really sort of mystified state where it's just very tricky. So I don't know that people need to be on bupe or methadone for the rest of their lives. I mean, there are plenty of clinical examples in my own practice and otherwise where that's not the case and people do well. But we also know that there's a push because of stigma against medication. There's sometimes an inappropriate push to get people off these medications way too quickly. Like it's somehow more virtuous to be off the medication, and then that winds up putting people in a position for relapse for no good reason whatsoever. But I just think we need to look more deeply at that issue.
We have time for one more if you want to go for it, Beth.
Okay, great. Yeah, I could go on forever. Let's see. They're also such good questions. Okay, here's a good kind of general question. Can you cycle through the alternatives to AA and how to access those resources for those of us supporting family members who've not been successful with the AA abstinence model?
So, yeah, with the caveat, this is not medical advice and just general informational purposes, I suppose I'm supposed to say. Um, but there are many varieties to mutual help programs, and uh, one thing I'll say about them first is that my own experience was AA wasn't totally working for me. I was mandated to it as part of my own treatment. And then I later got into Buddhist recovery. And it was through experience with Buddhist recovery that I got to connect with more of the good stuff about AA. So I think these things sometimes are portrayed as pathways to recovery, but it's really more dynamic in practice. And sometimes there can be a really nice interplay there. But I'll answer your question. The question was, can I cycle through some of the examples? So smart recovery is a huge one. It's more based in sort of like psychological principles and workbooks and exercises, and it's often moderated. There are agnostic groups, like and atheistic groups, such as secular organizations for sobriety. There are many different faith-based programs. So I would count the Buddhist Recovery Network as one of them. There's Celebrate Recovery. And then there are a lot of local groups that are coming up. And I think there's a sort of there are many more, and there are also online guides about like sort of like cataloging some of these options. But there's also things that aren't necessarily formalized in some sort of organization that has a website, but local sites for peer recovery, and many good peer services programs and recovery community organizations that connect people with peers. And sometimes it's not so much about like finding the right organization in my experience working with patients, but more about getting the one individual connection or getting like the one small group connection. So I think addiction is really diverse and heterogeneous and personal. And just like finding a good therapist, it's about finding the right fit. So I think there's a lot of hope in the fact that there are so many great options out there.
Julia, can I ask one more?
I'm okay with that.
Thanks. Okay, so somebody's pointing out that you're in Portugal, which we mentioned earlier, and I know that's a super like interesting place to be for somebody who studies addiction because they've handled it so differently. Could you talk about some of the ways Portugal has been able to do so much better managing addiction than the US?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief because the part of the answer is I don't know yet, and that's why I'm here, because I think I needed more of a longitudinal and deep immersion in Portuguese culture. But the reason I felt I needed that was because sometimes I see Portugal discussed as if they made some sort of technocratic tweak where they decriminalized drugs and did a few other things around the edges, and then everything was cool. And that's not my understanding of how it worked. That Portugal had a massive drug crisis, in part because of former like overly prohibitionist approaches. And they did decriminalize a lot of drugs, well, all drugs for personal use. But the amazing thing they did is they coupled that with enormous investments in not just concrete supports like healthcare and housing, but also really meaningful vocational engagement and giving people the opportunity for finding meaning and purpose through work and through community support. And so it's a great illustration, as far as I can tell, of the need for a holistic perspective on a societal response to drug addiction. It's not just about decriminalization. I think most of our drugs are over criminalized. Some examples are probably underregulated. Alcohol is a big one. I'm not in favor of prohibition, but I think it's massively underregulated right now and a leading cause of harms. The Portuguese experiment shows that it's not just about decriminalization; it also has to be coupled with social supports that are focused on fundamental health equity and health justice in a meaningful way.
Thank you both so much. We truly could go on for another hour. We do want Carl Erik Fisher in Portugal to get to sleep this evening. Thank you both for joining us. We will have to defer the rest of these amazing questions and engagement to the book. It's The Urge, Our History of Addiction. You can follow the link in the chat to grab it from us at Politics and Prose. It comes out next week. Be sure to pre-order now. Again, many thanks to author Erik Fisher and Beth Macy this evening. What a fascinating and amazing discussion. Everyone out there, feel free to check out our events calendar for everything else coming down the line. And until we see you next time, we hope you're out there staying strong, staying safe, and of course, staying well read. We will see you next time. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, everyone.